The end of the fighting in World War I and the Treaty of Versailles didn't really bring a complete end to the controversies and conflicts that had been part and parcel of the war. Especially in terms of economics, the European countries were very slow to recover from the kind of dislocations that they had. It was difficult to reconvert industry. It was difficult to get consumer spending back online. It was hard to set up political stability in the wake of all the destruction and all the death. What we find is a variety of different responses. And what I want to look at in this video is how the democracies dealt with the problems that were an outcome of the war. In the Western democracies, particularly in Britain, France, and the United States, what we find coming on the backside of the war is an effort to sort of reestablish conservative, but not radically conservative control. There's a great deal of fear that's left over from the Bolshevik Revolution, the communist takeover of the Soviet Union. And the Western democracies are going to be very, very frightened of movements like socialism and communism. Now you have to do a balancing act because the other side of the equation is the far right, the fascist nationalists that we will talk about in a later video. And so Britain and France are trying to work in between these. And one of the things that they find is that the Treaty of Versailles isn't exactly working in their favor. Like I said, it's very difficult to get their economies back online. Britain had gone from being the financier of the Western world to sort of passing the torch to the Americans, and at the same time borrowing a lot of money that the Americans fully expected to have paid back. On several occasions, the British had approached the Americans and said, hey, you didn't lose as many people in the war as we did. How about we say all those dollars were your contribution? And the Americans wouldn't compromise on that. They wanted the loans paid back. At the same time, British governments, conservative governments, are attempting to both appease business and keep labor from becoming overly upset. Britain experiments with price controls, keeps the prices down. That makes industry happy, but wage workers don't like the fact that their wages are frozen, and you get demonstrations like the Gero March and other labor efforts. When these occur, the British government tends to write them off as being socialist inspired or communistically inspired and not recognize that there are legitimate grievances. The French are also experiencing problems with the Treaty of Versailles system. They relied very heavily on those reparations that have been placed on Germany in order to fund their own transition and rebuilding. When the German government proved reluctant or slow in providing those funds, the French took matters into their hands and they worked within the system of the treaty, but it meant invading German territory. It meant antagonizing the Germans by being as specific to the letter of the treaty as possible. It made the French look vindictive, and the Germans were going to play on that. The British were less willing to be quite so harsh, and the Americans as well, and even suggested that maybe some renegotiation would be a good thing. The fascist leaders in Germany are going to play on that, and they're going to say, look, there's division amongst the democracies. Even they don't agree with how hard they treated us. In the end, these stumbling efforts to try to get their economies back online are going to be dealt a death blow in 1929. The global Great Depression is going to knock all the economies offline. And for the next decade, really, these democratic governments are going to be struggling very hard in the face of both challenges from the left and the right to reestablish their legitimacy. The United States has much the same situation. They elect a series of conservative, pro-business Republican administrations who attempt to remove government interference from industry, who are very unwilling to listen to the demands of labor. In fact, like the British, will write any labor movements off as being either socialistically or communistically inspired, and will pass legislation, will interpret laws that are very, very pro-industry, without keeping a real close eye on some of the economic implications. The Americans are one of the hardest hit nations when the crash comes in 1929. Part of the reason the crash is so massive, though, is because of how internationalized economics have become. Realizing that the British and the French needed the reparations from the Germans to help fund their transitions, the Americans had provided a series of loans, the Dawes and Young loans, that were meant to help the Germans get their industry back on their feet so that they could then make their reparations payments, and those reparations payments could help the British and the French governments get back on their feet, and then they could in turn make repayments on their loans. And the upshot was that it wound up being American tax dollars taking sort of a European cruise through Germany to France and Britain and then back home to pay off American bankers who had made loans during the war. All of this internationalization means that when weakness in the German and Austrian economies topple some key banks there, it brings the entire economic system crashing down. It's more complex than that, but basically everybody's tied together, so everybody sinks and swims together. The Americans and the Germans are going to be the hardest hit by this. And the American government is going to wind up having to go from being very pro-business, very anti-labor, very hands-off, laissez-faire 19th century, to a more social service interested governmental system, providing direct assistance to their citizens. In this, the British and the French will do the same sort of accounting, the same sort of transition in their government to providing more direct assistance to citizens, to backing off on some of the rhetoric of socialism, communism, of an activist government that has to not only take the economy in mind, but also has to consider the needs of their people. In the end, after a decade of depression, it's not really surprising that these alternative governments wind up providing a dangerous combination of competition and challenge to the democratic governments, so that when the world breaks out in a generalized war again in 1939, the democracies aren't able to meet it with a strong united front. Instead, they're dealing with domestic issues that have simply become overwhelming because of the independent nature of the countries that tried to deal with them and a lack of cooperation in the international spectrum.